Alright, the Game Awards are on December 8th. There will be game announcements during those Game Awards. Will one of those game announcements be DLC for Elden Ring? Obviously there's nothing confirmed, but if we look at the historical precedent, I think there's a good chance. First of all, there's been data mining that is very suggestive of DLC. The latest patch for Elden Ring had things labeled under DLC 1, and the stuff in there was like new hairstyles, things that suggested a new map, new legacy dungeons, up to 30 bosses, the activation of 3 arenas around the map. Again, nothing's confirmed by From Software yet, but I think the contents of the patch make it more likely that there is a DLC coming than there's not a DLC coming. And assuming that they are working on a DLC and there will be a DLC at some point, then an announcement on the Game Awards makes a lot of sense. If you look at past Souls games and take note of how long it took for them to release their DLC, it fits quite well. Dark Souls 1 released it 11 months after the game. Dark Souls 2 released its DLC 3 months after the game. Dark Souls 3, 7 months. Bloodborne, 8 months. For Elden Ring, it's already been more than 9 months. So if there was going to be an announcement around this time frame, the Game Awards make a lot of sense. It's the best venue for making that announcement. I think there's a decent chance. And given that that's a possibility, now is as good a time as any to speculate on that DLC, talk about what we want to see from it, and what it could add to Elden Ring to make it even better. Historically, the DLC of the Souls games is always the best part of the game. Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne. In my opinion, the DLCs for each of those games is substantially of a higher quality than the base game. And in my opinion, the DLCs aren't just good on their own, they make the base game better, by adding bosses and story elements that recontextualize a lot of the base game. That's what happened with Dark Souls 3, that's what happened with Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2's DLC was so good, it made me retroactively like Dark Souls 2. Originally, I didn't like Dark Souls 2 very much, but I felt the DLCs redeemed pretty much the whole thing. So I don't even consider Elden Ring a complete product until I see that DLC, until I see what they come up with. So, what do I personally want out of the DLC? Let's break it up into little sections. First of all, I want a new open world area to explore. If you saw my latest Elden Ring video, some of you might be thinking to yourselves, Redatosker, you spent a whole video complaining about Elden Ring's open world. How can you be asking for more open world? I saw several comments in the video like that. But no, that's not what happened. In that video I mentioned that the magic of exploring the open world really only lasts one playthrough. And that for me, that led to Elden Ring having a lower replay value than the other Souls games. But that has no bearing on the quality of the first playthrough. The quality of the first playthrough is quite high, and I enjoy getting hypnotized and losing myself in exploring it. If I had a complaint at all, my complaint is that I can't do that again for the first time. A new open world biome, a new section though, sidesteps that problem, because it's new. I've heard a lot of people saying that they don't want a new biome, they don't want a new open world area, they just want From Software to focus on legacy dungeon styled content, and that instead of making a new map, a new area, they should take all of those resources and pour it into making several legacy dungeons. I think that's unrealistic, they're not going to do that. First of all, like I mentioned earlier, the data mines suggest that there's going to be a new open world area. But second of all, that isn't how From Software works usually. In From Software games, the DLC usually represents a refinement of what they were doing in the base game. The whole open worldness of Elden Ring is its defining characteristic. They're not going to abandon it. If we're lucky though, they might refine it and make it the best example of this open world. It could be the best biome that they've made so far. All I really want from the open world section of the DLC is a nice area that's relatively densely packed with things to find, and that has nice soothing music to go with the exploration. Now let's talk about the mini-dungeons, because if they have a new open world area, they're going to have more mini-dungeons in it. Again, a lot of people complain about the mini-dungeons. I think I've even complained about the mini-dungeons. But I actually like the mini-dungeons quite a bit. It took a long time for me to get tired of them in the base game. I thought they were just fun combat sections, you know. But maybe I'm the outlier here, because I actually also enjoyed the Chalice dungeons in Bloodborne. And I've heard a lot of people dislike those too. So maybe I'm not representative of the whole community. But even though I have no problem with the mini-dungeons and I would like to see them in the new DLC, there's a couple of things that would make them better for me, a couple of things that I would ask. First of all, if they just changed how they looked visually a little bit, I think that would go a long way. In the base game, basically every catacomb area looks identical to every other catacomb area. It's not the biggest deal, but these new mini-dungeons I think would benefit a lot from being visually more appealing than their predecessors. It doesn't have to be a big change, just anything that makes them look visually distinct from all the mini-dungeons that were before. Like this new area should have mini-dungeons that look a little different than the others, that fits whatever theme the DLC is going for. If it's a heavily wooded area, then the mini-dungeon should have like little growths in them, colorful blooms or something, you know? If it's a freezing environment, then, you know, there should be icicles in the mini-dungeons, ice on the walls, just anything that visually makes it a part of what's going on in the overworld. More importantly though, I think that the mini-dungeons in the DLC should be much longer and more complex. This is actually much more important to me than the aesthetic thing. The base game actually had some banger mini-dungeons, some really excellent mini-dungeons. And a few of them had some really cool ideas, like there was that one with the teleporting treasure chest. You open a treasure chest and it teleports you somewhere else. And then you have to figure out how to navigate the labyrinth this way, figuring out which chests lead where. Stuff like that was cool. In the Bloodborne Chalice dungeons, they were also boring and samey, but they were also complex sometimes. They were difficult to navigate. Some were so difficult to navigate, I would use the shiny coins as markers to make sure I know that I've been that way before, as I'm trying to find the right way to go. Fundamentally, that's actually what I want out of all these little mini dungeons, and even the big dungeons. I want them to be so elaborate and complex that I get lost, and then I start using those shiny things as markers to places that I've already been. Sometimes the things get so complex that I do that. That's all I want out of my Souls game. Out of my Souls navigation and exploration and level design, I want stuff so complicated that I need to place those little shiny markers. Now as for the new Legacy dungeon, assuming that there's only one, I pretty much completely trust From Software when it comes to this. They have done nothing but a great job with the Legacy dungeons that we have so far. Stormveil and Leyendell I think I'm just completely happy with. So I don't really have anything to say on this point, I think they're going to do a great job regardless. Now moving on to the next natural point, let's talk about the rewards that might be placed in the Legacy dungeons and the mini dungeons. Obviously there's going to be all kinds of new weapons, new Ashes of War, stuff like that. But according to Sekiro Dubi, in the latest patch, he data mined what appears to be a new weapon type. So not just a new weapon, a new type of weapon. Which is cool and all, but I can't even imagine what it could be. Looking at the roster of weapons that we already have for Elden Ring, we pretty much have everything. I can't even imagine what they could add at this point. The DLC is sure to have more Ashes of War, more spells and incantations, more weapons and armor, more talismans and the like. But regardless of that, I'll tell you what I know that I want out of the new DLC weapons. I would like weapons that are also catalysts, that are also staves, you know, that you can cast spells with. I think pretty much all of the other Souls games, except maybe Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls, had weapons that you could use to cast spells. One of my favorite weapons is the Carian Knight Longsword, and in the description it says that Carian Knights used that to cast spells. You can't actually use the sword that way though, all it does is cast Carian Grandeur. So if they're not going to change that, in the DLC I would like a new weapon that you can use to cast spells with. Also, speaking of Carian Grandeur, they should give it hyper armor. Just do it. Not like a bunch, but some. Like give me a little hyper armor for that. And actually, speaking of the Carian Longsword, this weapon, along with the Lazuli Straightsword, has a unique R2 attack. Its R2 is actually a block. He raises the sword over his head, blocks an oncoming attack, and still can keep going. It's pretty awesome. It's one of my favorite moves, but it's stuck on these two specific weapons. And sadly, neither of these weapons can change their Ash of War. They're stuck with what they got. It's kind of a shame. It's not a big deal, but if the DLC introduces new longswords, I would like one that lets me have this R2 attack on a longsword that can change its Ash of War. Finally, on the list of things I personally would like to see, is new paired weapons. At the moment, there's only two, and those are the Ornamental Straightswords and the Radahn's Ultra Greatswords. We need a lot more. Those two are pretty cool already, and the Ornamental Straightswords are actually some of my favorite weapons in the game. They might be my favorite weapon. One of the appeals of these paired swords is that they have unique attacks that you can't get from dual wielding. So for example, the ornamental straight swords have a unique jumping attack, and they have a unique running attack. And that's apart from their cool, unique R2. So I would love to see the variation in moveset with a paired katana, or a paired dagger, or a paired spears. If you haven't noticed by now, I'm very fond of the potential that slight variations on weapons can have in both PvE and PvP. Finally, let's actually talk about PvP. The data mine suggests that this DLC will have a heavy focus on PvP. If you're interested, I would suggest going to Sekiro Doobie's channel and taking a look at what he's found so far. I'm pretty sure he's done the most work on this subject. Now, if From Software does focus on PvP in this first DLC, that actually makes a lot of sense. In the past, From Software has done the same things. In Dark Souls 1, the DLC introduced the arena. And in Dark Souls 3, the first DLC introduced its arena as well. The data mines are very suggestive that the Colosseums will be the arenas for the new DLC. And Elden Ring has been pretty good with patches. They've added a bunch of PvP-related patches at a decent rate. And the latest patch just recently introduced the really wonderful mechanic where they can adjust the scaling for weapons and damage for PvP without affecting that damage for PvE, which is a great system. They should have had this implemented forever ago. So given that the DLC will likely have this PvP focus in it, here's what I would personally like to see. First of all, they need to increase the number of players that can be in a world at once. It was a terrible mistake to reduce that number. In Dark Souls 3, because you could summon a lot of Red Phantoms at once, there was an organic Fight Club culture. Red Phantoms would wait their turn, they wouldn't attack the host. They duel each other while the host continuously summons more Red Phantoms, and it ends when the host finally goes down and fights Phantom and gets himself killed. If any of the Phantoms attempt to attack the host outside of a duel, the others would gang up on that person. It was a really cool system that no one created, it just sprung up on its own. There was a culture around it, there were social norms, and all of it is gone, just completely obliterated because Elden Ring can't have more than 2 Red Phantoms at a time. The next thing that I want is Covenants, and Covenant-protected locations. If you entered one of these Covenant-protected locations, members of that Covenant would be called to the area to defend it and invade you. What was fun to do often was to activate a dried finger, go into these locations, and try and see how many of these Phantoms you could kill before you go down. And it can be pretty fun being a Covenant member as well, because fights got really hectic. It could turn into 3v3s. Oftentimes as a Covenant member, you would go into a world and there would be a group of 3 gankers in there, already fighting some of your Covenant members. The people that did this were often well prepared and had accrued every advantage the game allowed them. So they really, really didn't want to lose. Beating those people was particularly satisfying, because they had so many advantages and you had so few. It was great. If they did choose to do that again, and add Covenant-specific invasion areas, then that would benefit greatly from the increased player limit that I mentioned earlier. Now, even though I think that these would be great additions, I'm not sure how likely they would be. There's probably a technical reason why Elden Ring chose to reduce the number of players in a world, and if there was, then the DLC probably won't change that, even if it is a PvP-focused DLC. Now finally, let's talk about the story. The lore, what I'm hoping for the DLC in that space. I made a video a while ago, pretty much admitting I don't understand the lore of Elden Ring. I don't understand the story, I don't understand the basic plot, and most importantly, I don't understand the theme that it's going for. Which is an odd admission, given how many lore videos I've made. But it's true, I think that more than any other Souls game, Elden Ring is missing pieces of the puzzle. And neither my own speculation nor anybody else's video that I've seen fill in the gaps to my satisfaction. And this, I think, is where the DLC comes in. My greatest hope isn't that the DLC explicitly tells me anything, it's that the DLC connects things in a certain way that will trigger an understanding, an epiphany in my mind, and will allow me to connect other things in different ways, and finally make so many of these mysteries much more clear. Now, some of my peers and people on the internet, I've seen comments that have said things like, everybody's expecting answers in this DLC, but all we're going to get is just more questions, just like always. But I don't really agree with that cynical view. And I don't agree that the DLCs don't answer previously established questions and just add in more mystery. In fact, I think it does just the opposite. The Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3 DLCs make the contents of the base game a lot more clear. They elaborate on the central theme more directly. In fact, we have Miyazaki's own admission that the Dark Souls 3 DLCs were supposed to parallel the central theme of the main game. They were supposed to show you what Dark Souls was all about by reiterating the same point from a different perspective. So I'm personally very hopeful for this DLC. I think that it will connect certain ideas together that I haven't thought of, and that if it makes those connections, I might be able to go the rest of the way myself. Or at least maybe those connections will inspire thoughts in some other lore person, and that lore person will make a video, and then his video will inspire me to make other connections. I am so excited. That's really what all of this lore stuff is all about. And that's the end of this video. As always, thank you very much for watching.